What is up, people? Welcome back to the Pragmatic Guide to Building Muscle with myself, Shane Story. Today we're going to be going through intensity methods. If you're new to the series, there are plenty of other videos to go through. There's 8 before this one, which go over the foundations of building a program for building muscle. So it's important before we get into this that you have some context and some understanding of all the other variables that came before this. Because these things, they're very much the cherry on top. And while they can be very effective for gaining muscle, they are not necessarily going to be the thing that your program should revolve around. Now, before we get into the video, if you do me a big favor and leave me a like in the video, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe and consider watching earlier videos. I'm very close to hitting my goal of 1,000 subscribers, so please help me get working hard for it. So just hit the subscribe button there for me and you'd be doing me a solid. To show my appreciation, I have in the description a guide encapsulating everything that we've discussed in the previous 8 videos. We go through landmarks with volume recommendations, intensity recommendations, how to adjust exercises, and everything else. So the guide is below. Download free Pragmatic Guide to Building Muscle. Thank you very much for watching, subscribing, and following along with the series. To recap on how we make decisions when it does come to our training, we run everything through our decision filter. Is the program specific to our goals? Is what we're doing within the gym progressible? Is it repeatable and enjoyable? And is it actually effective for gaining muscle? And intensity methods are a nice aspect to layer on everything else that we've covered. Now, you might have heard of intensity methods labeled as advanced training techniques, and you don't necessarily need to be advanced to actually follow them. And I'm actually going to go into some context where they can be very useful for the beginner trainee. But before we get into that, one thing we have to come back to is what is the goal of what we're doing within our training sessions, right? It's to try to balance stimulus with fatigue. We want to ensure we're getting a high amount of stimulus while getting a level of fatigue that we can recover from by the time we get into the next session. And that's where actually implementing these becomes quite important, because depending on what phase you're in, you might be able to handle more intensity methods than others. An example here is somebody who is doing a contest prep for bodybuilding. They're coming into their final few weeks of prep, implementing loads of rest pause sets, loads of MyRep sets, loads of drop sets. It's probably not going to be too useful for them because of the amount of fatigue that's driving relative to the stimulus they're getting and relative to the stimulus they can also adapt from. Because at that stage of a contest prep, you're really just looking at retaining muscle, and especially as you come into the likes of peak week, you want to have fatigue low enough so that you can peak effectively and bring your best to stage. So this is where actually knowing when to put them into your program is going to make sense, and also factor into with your own recoverability. Because somebody who's already very highly strung, they have a high stress load day to day, they already have a very low amount of workload that they can tolerate and recover from and actually adapt to, maybe implementing some of these is not going to be the best thing for them. So it's really important to note that when we are implementing an intensity method, we can still get a very large stimulus from our training, but they typically do increase a lot of fatigue as a result. And it's important that this fatigue is something that you can manage and recover from. And you'll be able to tell this as you go through your training weeks based off how you recover and perform as you go through those training weeks. So that's first and foremost where we fit this within our decision filter. Is it something that's progressible and repeatable? Okay, because if we are finding that we're implementing one of these intensity methods, say drop sets, and we're not able to have any progression take place within that drop set over the course of the coming few weeks, it's not going to be something that's going to be very effective for our muscle gain goals, because we're not really able to progress it because we're not recovering from it. The other part of the decision filter it needs to pass is it repeatable and enjoyable? Because for some people, they'll relish the opportunity to do something like a rest pause set. For other people, it's the last thing they want to do. And as a result of having that in the program, no matter how effective or efficient it may be for that person, it may not necessarily be something that's going to be worthwhile because it's not going to be repeatable. And if something's not repeatable, it's not enjoyable, we don't do it long term, we're not going to get any beneficial adaptation from it because we're only getting maybe one exposure when ideally you want to have a set amount of volume that we're progressing upon and increasing overload over time, rather than things coming into the program willy-nilly with no rhyme or reason as to why they're there. So let's get into our intensity methods. The first one we're going to look at is the drop set. Probably one of the most commonly used or understood intensity methods out of the gate from anybody who goes to the gym. you select the load, you do an initial top set, generally to failure, then you reduce the load by 20%, you repeat another cluster set, drop the load maybe again, and perform another cluster set. And typically people are going to be doing maybe 2 to 3 drops after that initial top set. So I'm just going to put TS for top set, and then minus 20% load, and then 2 to 3 drops. Now what will typically happen is on those 2 to 3 drops, even though you're having a drop in load, you may not be getting that many reps, okay? That's just a byproduct of this actual training style and these intensity methods. You're typically limiting rest so you can accumulate more work, and that's a feature of a lot of these intensity methods. You're typically trying to jam in a lot of effective work into a short amount of time, but as a result, you are going with less rest, so you can't recover effectively before you come into the cluster sets. Now, drop sets are going to be easier to perform on some exercises versus others, or some pieces of equipment versus others. An example here would be on a leg extension versus a leg press. When you're on a leg extension, it's typically pin loaded. You're going to be able to adjust the pin after the top set down to your next drop very quickly, so you're able to kind of keep in line with that minimal rest between the top set to your clusters. Compare that to the leg press. You perform your initial top set, unless you have a spotter, you have to get up out of the seat, take the plates off, and get back down. By the time you actually get into your next set, you probably have had about a minute of rest, especially if that initial top set was to an appropriate RPE or appropriate intensity level. Because with these initial top sets, we're really looking to push towards failure, because it is that initial set which is giving us the most bang for our buck across pretty much drop sets, rest pause, and my reps. It's the initial set is giving us the most stimulus, and then we're getting like little kind of bits on top when we're doing the likes of the clusters after. Another common example is when people do something like strip to rack drop sets, where you could be doing dumbbell curls, for example. Maybe you start off with the 20s, and once you hit the 20s, now you drop to the 15s, then you drop to the 10s, then you drop to the 5s. That's also a very common way of doing these drop sets. Keep in mind that the 20% load drop is not a rule, it's just a recommendation. But the strip to racks, very, very common. You'll see it in bodybuilding videos where people are doing strip to rack sets with the likes of lateral raises. Again, another way of just getting in a lot of volume in a short amount of time. And we'll get into why we do this when we get to the purpose and when to use and when not to use. After drop sets, we have rest pause sets. So rest pause set, similarly again, you're gonna have a top set. After the top set, you will rest for 30 seconds. You'll keep the same weight in the bar, and then you'll do anywhere between 1 to 3 cluster sets. So what that would look like is you take your top set, 30 seconds rest, 1 cluster, all out to failure, 30 seconds rest, cluster set, all out to failure. And if you're really feeling sadistic, you'd go for the third one and you would do another one to failure, okay? Typically, 1 to 2 clusters after the top set is the most people can handle if they're training with a decent amount of intensity, especially since you're keeping the exact same load in the bar. Similarly with the drop sets, there are going to be certain exercises which are going to suit themselves really well to rest pause sets, and other ones which are just going to have a little bit of a higher risk. So when we're looking at performing rest pause, ideally we want to do it in something that's pretty externally stabilized, which is not going to have us kind of moving around too much and shifting load onto muscles that can compensate movement. We also want to perform it in machines or with equipment that is going to be relatively safe to fail. Because if we stick with the example of the person maybe doing the leg extension as well as the person doing leg press, failing a leg extension is going to be fine, right? Like you just stop kicking against the pad. Generally, the risk is going to be quite low. Performing rest pause on a leg press, if you don't have a spotter, it can be quite risky because you don't really know when the last rep is going to be your last rep if you're pushing to a sufficient degree of intensity. And this is because with all of the metabolite accumulation that's going to happen within the muscle, it can be hard to really kind of gauge where failure is going to come, because sometimes a rep may move really, really slow and you might have another one left and you go for that one, and then you don't actually have that one left, and now all of a sudden the sled is squashing you. So it's important that if you're performing it on a machine that has a bit more risk involved, that you get a spotter. And this could be the same if you were to do it on a barbell bench press, for example. If you were completely sadistic and you did it on a barbell squat, right? There's no reason why you can't do it on these exercises, just more of a safety concern. And as well, if we keep in line with other concepts that we talked about in previous videos, we want to ensure that throughout our training, we're keeping tension on the target muscle. The more wiggle room there is within an exercise, the more kind of freedom of movement, it can be very easy for us to shift that tension from the area that we wanted it initially to something else that's going to allow us to pick up the slack. And then we have MyoReps. MyoReps have been adapted somewhat from rest pause training. MyoReps essentially is a way of performing rest pause with a little bit of fatigue management baked into the plan. So this concept was developed by Borja Fejeli. I hope I pronounced his name right. I actually have a video with him on my YouTube channel where I recorded a podcast with him. So he invented the concept of MyoReps. So similar to the rest pause, you're going to have a top set. You're going to rest for 30 seconds. And then what you're going to do is you're going to perform a cluster. So I'm going to put C1 for cluster 1 to RPE9. Okay? So you don't push the failure the same way you push a rest pause to failure. You perform it to RPE9. However many reps you get on the first cluster, you want to ideally repeat as many clusters as you can up until you can no longer get the same amount of reps within that cluster. So an example here could be on your top set, you do 12 reps. Cluster number 1, you do 3 reps. Now on cluster 2, you want to get to 3 reps. On cluster 3, you want to get to 3 reps. If you get 2, the set is terminated. So the idea here is to accumulate as much effective reps as you can while not getting all the way to failure, still trying to keep some reps in the tank. And the idea here is because you're not training to true 10 out of 10 intensity, it can allow you to manage fatigue a little better and recover better between sessions. The same concept from drop sets and rest pause with exercise selection also carries over to MyoRep sets. And then we have the final intensity method which we're going to cover today, which is supersets. You do one exercise followed by another exercise with no rest. Once 2 exercises are complete, then you take your rest period. And we can do these in a multitude of different ways. We can do agonist, antagonist supersets where you train opposing muscle groups. So that could be you train your chest and your back or your biceps and your triceps. You can do peripheral supersets, which essentially is going to be working different areas of the body which are not going to have overlap. So that could be I do a bench press and I also do a leg extension. Then there's also compound supersets or agonist supersets, which would be I do a bench press and then I do a fly. And something else you can layer into supersets is things like trisets, giant sets, which would be as opposed to just doing 2 exercises in a row, you maybe do 3 or 4. Once you get to 4, it basically turns into circuit training. So the idea behind a superset is you do more work in less time. And sometimes, but depending on the way you set it up, you can also get a very, very good training stimulus without having much crossover from one muscle group to the next. And that's particularly when you're doing something like an agonist antagonist superset. Now, compound supersets can be a bit controversial because you are essentially going to be limiting strength when you perform a chest press and a chest fly. But ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is to gain muscle. And if you are looking to gain muscle, the goal is to stimulate the chest as much as possible in that scenario. So if you are doing a compound superset, while you will never get as strong as you potentially could have on a chest fly or on a chest press, if you just did those exercises as standalone rest periods and in straight sets, you will still be able to grow a decent amount of muscle by doing that. Once the tension develops within the muscle is of a sufficient intensity and you're able to somewhat overload it over time. Now, before we get into the purpose of these, which is probably somewhat understandable since I've talked a little bit how these save us time in the gym, one important thing to note is the progressibility of these. And this can sometimes be a criticism of actually using these. And sometimes for the beginner trainee or the intermediate even, they may not know how to actually progress these if they haven't within their plan. So I've already discussed with the likes of a drop set, rest pause, MyoRep set, they'll have a top set. So the top set is the set that's giving us the most bang for our buck. And then the additional clusters are just kind of adding on additional effective reps. Typically when I'm programming this, I will say to a client, I want you to perform 8 to 12 reps, 12 to 15 reps, whatever the rep range is. So that's the rep range of that initial set. Now, as they choose their training load, as they get up towards the top end of that rep range with their top set, they will simply add load to the top set the following week. So this is keeping in line with the double progression model, which I discussed in the progression video, which I'll put a card up here with. So it's a very simple process to progress these. You just need to have a strategy. And with the likes of supersets, we're essentially just going to program the same way we program any working sets in a program. We do a top set back off, straight sets. You do 2 sets of 6 to 10 on your chest press, 2 sets of 6 to 10 on your bent over rows or chest supported row, and just pair the two together. So that could just be an example there. But with these, we want to ensure that the top set is within the rep range, and then once you hit the top end of the rep range, we increase what also happens there is now the cluster sets are also increasing in load with the likes of your drop sets. The drops are now heavier than they were the previous week. And this is allowing you to essentially apply the principle of overload to this training method. Okay, now that I've given you a rundown on all the methods, we want to understand what is the purpose of having these in the plan in the first place. So the first one is going to be efficiency. When we apply any of these training methods, one of the biggest benefits is that they save us time. For a lot of people, they're constrained by their time for how much volume they can accumulate in a session. And typically, while using straight sets with ample rest between those sets is going to, in general, be the best way for us to train to gain muscle. Some of the time to get in the additional volume we may need with certain body parts, or on certain training days, we may actually need to think outside the box and apply some of these training methods. So a common example is just like the likes of supersets. You could have an upper body day, which you are pairing a vertical push and a vertical pull. Then you have a horizontal push and a horizontal pull. And then you have a superset with biceps and triceps. You've essentially reduced the overall amount of rest that you would have been doing within that training session quite considerably if you apply that out straight, because you're now essentially halving the amount of rest periods that you would have been doing if you just did all those exercises individually. So for the person who is time poor but still has a decent amount of workload that they need to get in to actually adapt and grow, these can be a very effective way for us to actually achieve our muscle building goals. They can also be very handy to do when we're in a situation where our training is more constrained than usual by time. And there, as opposed to doing our 3 sets on biceps, we decide, okay, I can't get the 3 sets in today, but I do have time to get in a rest pause. Because now, as a result of doing the rest pause versus doing your 3 sets with 2 to 3 minutes rest in between, you're doing your top set, rest for 30 seconds, do your cluster, rest for 30 seconds, and you've cut down on your training time quite a bit. And if you did that across a number of different exercises within that training day too, on exercises which were suitable to do rest pause, again, you would reduce the time that you had to be in the gym massively and be able to take care of the other priorities that you have within your life. So efficiency is a big one. And this is one of the main reasons why I'll program these for any of my clients. One of the other reasons why you may look at applying one of these intensity methods is simply going to be to teach intensity. So in the start of the video, I talked about applications for where to use these for the beginner trainee. And a lot of times, beginner trainees just don't really have a good gauge of what it feels like to train hard. And with that, it can cause some issues within their training programming because they may have to just do a lot of sets to get in all the effective reps they need to actually reach a close proximity to failure and in order to grow. So this is where something like a rest pause technique or my rep set or a drop set can come in very, very useful. Because what they're going to get is they're going to perform what they perceive to be a hard set, and then they're going to have their rest, and then they're going to have opportunities to say, hey, I just want you to push for as many more reps as you can here on this next cluster. Their performance is going to be constrained because they haven't rested enough, but they're at least going to get a sensation of what it feels like to have that muscle slow down in contraction speed and no longer be able to push out additional reps. Now, as they ingrain this skill, they may have an easier time on their straight sets to understand, okay, that's the level of intensity I want to get to. I want to get to the point where my reps are starting to slow down. I'm getting that sensation of what it felt like on that rest pause set where I was working really, really hard. So they can be a great tool for teaching and training intensity. And you start to apply these on safe to fail movements, which a person feels okay to do. Again, bicep curl, tricep extension, lateral raise, leg extension, these things are going to be relatively safe to fail, and they're not going to feel too scared about pushing to that place relative to an advanced bodybuilder wouldn't really mind doing this on a leg press or a hack squat or one of these bigger bang for your buck movements. Another reason could be just to add more volume. Maybe the person feels like they need to have some extra sets, but they don't quite have like the cognitive capacity to add in additional straight sets, or they just don't have the additional time. So this is where actually adding in some type of drop set after their straight sets can be an effective way to get in some additional stimulating reps rather than them spending way longer in the gym to get that extra stimulation. So this is where these methods can actually come into play. And one point I mentioned there was maintain focus. Being able to maintain focus within your training session is clearly important, because if it's not, you're not going to be able to push to the sufficient degree of effort to get what you want out of your training. And this can sometimes be towards the end of a session, right? When you're after having done all your big movements for the day, and now you're moving on to body parts that you don't really like training, right? Everybody has them. On those exercises, you just find doing your straight sets is kind of boring. Here would be a perfect place to add in one of these intensity methods, because you're going to do your initial set, of course, which you're getting the most bang for your buck, and then you'll have those short rest periods. So it feels as if you're training that body part a little bit harder than you would have if you had your straight sets, and also it allows you to maintain focus because you're able to say, okay, I just need to get this done. It's going to be over in literally 2-3 minutes max if I just like lock in for these next 2-3 minutes. And then all of a sudden you have more effective work done relative to going to your 3 sets of 8 to 12 and just sandbagging every set and rushing your rest times anyway, and having just per performance towards the end of the session and not getting that much out of that actual exercise. And as a result, not getting that much growth. And the final reason, which I'm going to add in, and it has to do with one of the steps within our decision filter, which is repeatability and enjoyment. Sometimes just adding in something like this can just be fun, you know, and having fun is an important part of training, right? Once we're keeping consistent with that element of fun within our training program. So every now and again, you might decide, as opposed to doing straight sets, right? After a couple of weeks your meso cycle is finished and you want to add in a little bit more variety, you realize that maybe there's certain exercises you're not giving as much effort towards. Say, hey, how about I try to make this fun somehow and improve my level of focus, improve my level of intensity, maybe even make my training a little bit more efficient. Let me add in a drop set. Let me add in a superset. And just this slight tweak in your programming, again, improves your overall effort. It improves the repeatability of those efforts. It improves the enjoyment. It makes the exercise a little bit more progressive for you now because you're actually putting in more effort, and as a result, it makes it more effective. So again, don't dismiss the role of having a bit of fun within your training. It doesn't need to be boring, right? Like ultimately, we need to be enjoying your training for it to pass the decision filter first and foremost. But don't dismiss the element of fun for adding these in, right? Because they can be very fun. So now we went through our methods, our purpose of why we include them. Let's talk about when to use and when not to use. So we're going to cover just the easiest ones to understand here, which is going to be time constraints. We talked about this when we talked about efficiency. We have also when to use isolations is a great place to use these methods with. Again, because they're typically safe to fail. They have a low fatigue component anyway to them relative to doing them with compound lifts. So another reason why we might think about using them in isolations is there's just less skill involved in isolation lift. You only really have to stabilize and work through one joint relative to if you are performing a multi-joint movement where there's more skill involved, there could be more coordination loss as you go into the cluster sets when fatigue starts to set in. And as fatigue starts to set in, your skill coordination starts to go down. You start to shift tension off the target muscle onto other ones. So this is where performing isolations with these methods can be a little bit more meaningful. And that's not to say we can only use isolations. It's just a good recommendation. But when we do look at maybe supersets, that could be where we actually do use some more compound lifts, especially if we're looking at agonist antagonist supersets, so opposing muscle groups, or we're looking at peripheral supersets. So we can filter on top of this low skill lifts, and this is an important consideration as well for even the compounds which I talked about when it does come to the agonist antagonist. Performing a squat with an RDL, not too fun, and it's unlikely you're going to be able to push both to sufficient degree of failure until your lower back starts to give out. But if you were to perform a leg press and a lying hamstring curl, that'd be fine. Both lifts are externally restrained. There's less skill involved relative to the others, so the RDL and the squat. You're training the same muscle groups, but they're also going to be both a little bit kind of safer to fail, especially with the leg press if you do have a spotter there. But even with a leg press, if you take it to 1 rep in reserve, you're still getting an adequate stimulus. Whereas taking a squat to 1 rep in reserve alongside the RDL, that could be an outer body experience. If you are going to perform compounds, ensure that they are going to be ones which are relatively safe to fail and they don't have a huge amount of skill involved. Then the final considerations for when to use is going to be end of session, or at least it would ideally, when you perform it, be the last exercise for that particular muscle group. And the reason I'd say this is because when you perform any of these correctly to the right amount of intensity, especially the MyRep Stress Pause drop sets, they can be uniquely fatiguing, right? They can just have you feeling almost like disoriented once you have them done because of the amount of neurological fatigue that is going to be building up. So it's important that you save these for exercises towards the end of the session, or at least it's the last exercise for that particular muscle, and you don't have any other exercise for that muscle after it, because you could have too big of a performance loss that the next exercise is just not even really worth doing. So it's important to keep that in mind if your goal is to ultimately manage fatigue and manage performance and manage recoverability within that specific session. Because if we do one of those intensity methods too early on, and that impacts your ability to perform well with the rest of your exercises, you could be undertraining relative to what you could recover from, and as a result, just not growing as much. So when not to use, first off, I'd say is high scale free weights. So it's really just a safety concern when we're looking at performing high scale lifts in this fashion. There's the coordination loss aspect. There's the fact that you are going to be already putting yourself in a position where you're generating a high amount of fatigue with the method itself. Never mind how much fatigue when pushed to a sufficient degree of failure some of those lifts can be. Common example, a deadlift, a barbell squat. There's a lot of moving parts. A lot of stuff can not necessarily go wrong, but for the concept of gaining muscle, we can very easily shift tension away from the areas we're actually trying to work. Even for something like a squat, for example, you'd be better off having a spotter there present, and that's not always possible for a lot of people. And a skilled spotter at that. And following on from what we talked about in when to use, and the opposite of the previous section, we don't want to perform these early on in the session. And we probably also don't want to include when our recovery is already limited. Because if we're already stretched in from a recovery perspective, adding something else in, while it's going to drive a high amount of stimulus, as I mentioned at the start of the video, it's going to drive in a lot more fatigue. So consider when you're going to add these in. These are better off to be used in an off-season or gaining phase setting, or even at maintenance, versus using them a lot when you're dieting, because fatigue is already going to be quite high in the diet from the diet itself, the cardio you may be doing, the extra steps you may be doing, and adding something like this on top may just be a little bit too much for you to recover well from the entirety of your training program. And as a result, you start to notice that maybe progressions overall start to slow down, and maybe you need to deload more frequently. So that's just a big caveat when you are considering to use these. You want to ensure that recovery is at a good spot. And you know recovery is a good spot because you'll be able to monitor your performance and see how performance is actually trending. So that pretty much covers us today for intensity methods. The biggest take home I want you to take from this video is that these methods can be a great way to accumulate more effective volume in a short amount of time relative to just adding in additional straight sets. However, with the addition of that volume, given the fact we're going to be performing it with less rest, they can also have a greater increase to fatigue. So if we're adding them in, we want to ensure that we have recovery available, because if not, all we're doing is layering on additional fatigue that may be hampering our ability to adapt and grow, and therefore it is going to impact our decision filter, and therefore it's going to impact our ability to actually gain muscle that we want. So keep that in mind. If we have recovery available, we can greenlight these, put them in logically and methodically, the same way we do any training decision that we make within our training program. It needs to pass the decision filter. It needs to be progressive. It needs to be something we can do repeatable. It needs to be something we can recover from and adapt to and grow. If not, we're just kind of wasting our time. That's it for this video. Hopefully you did enjoy it. If you did, please make sure to like the video, subscribe if you have not already, and I'll catch you in the next one.